everyone. This is your Arlington Dollar. I'm James MILAN, and I am with a familiar face to longtime Your Arlington Dollar watchers, and it is Dean Carman. But we are speaking to Dean in his official capacity as treasurer for Arlington, and we're going to be talking about the forecasts that were presented to the Budget Revenue Task Force recently. Just getting into the weeds with Dean, who is one of our favorite people to do so with, just to make sure that we understand as well as possible what the various alternatives are for Arlington taxpayers, frankly, in terms of the big asks that are coming up from the structural override and the debt exclusion around the school. So, Dean, welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome back to your
Yes.
Arlington Dollar, your home away from home.
Glad to be here.
And we're glad to have you. So, as I mentioned, the Budget Revenue Task Force was presented with a number of scenarios for how we will be navigating the next number of years here in Arlington, including the big projects that are coming up. So, love to just ask you, as a member, why don't you tell the audience, as treasurer, what your involvement is with the coming up of these projections and forecasts.
Yes, so as treasurer, I serve on many of the town's, I'd say, district-wide or town-wide committees, which would include the Long Range Planning Committee, which has representatives of the Selectmen, School Committee, and the town's finance departments, and we work on a lot. We review periodically, quarterly, maybe sometimes more than that, the town's long-range 5-year plan. We give input to the town manager on how we think it should be shaped and how things should work. And then from there, less frequently, the Budget Revenue Task Force, which is an even larger group of stakeholders, which brings in our state reps, state senator, labor unions, I think those are the larger groups that come in. We will meet periodically as well. So let's say once or twice a year to go over the same projections and the work that the Long Range Planning Committee is doing. And then as treasurer, I'm also on the Capital Planning Committee, which is an important committee that decides or reviews capital projects and long-term spending in the town.
Okay, so throughout the budget cycle, you are involved kind of very intimately with all of the arguments, the policy discussions, the balancing of priorities, et cetera.
Yes.
We knew you were the right person to talk to about this. So why don't you just kind of give us a sense, and then we will in the latter part of our conversation, slip on over to the table near us and look actually at the computer at some of these numbers and dig into them a little bit more. But just give us a general sense of what kinds of alternative scearios we're talking about here.
Sure. So as a backdrop, since around the early to mid 2000s, the town created a long-term financial plan to maintain budget stability over several years, which we call we've always referred to as the 5-year plan. And the way it works is, back around 2004, 2005, the town went out for an override where the commitment was in the early years, year 1 or 2 of the override, they were going to collect more tax dollars. We're going to collect more tax dollars in the town than we needed. We were going to bank that away. In year 3, we were going to be about break even. And then year 4 and 5, we were going to spend that money we had banked in year 1 and 2.
The first couple of years.
Yes, because what's been going on, like a lot of municipal communities, is we have a structural deficit where our revenues, which are constrained on many levels, are not keeping up with our expenditures. So the first 5-year plan got us through, I think, about 6 years. I think the 5-year plan became a 6-year plan. We entered into the second plan, which was supposed to be a 3-year plan, and now I think it's going to end up being a 9 or 10-year plan.
So that was the 2011.
Exactly, yeah, the 2011 override. What happens though, and this is why we talk a lot about the scenarios, if you think about that you're banking money in the early years to use in the later years, you're creating a cliff effect where, the deficit in the years where you run out of money becomes larger and larger and larger. And so when you have a 9 or possibly 10-year span without an override, at the end of that 10th year when your deficit arrives, it's going to be a big deficit. And so the question now becomes, how do we bridge the gap, and in what way do you do it? And so as a long-range planning committee, as Budget Revenue Task Force, we're trying to grapple with, should we wait till we get to the very end of that? So you get to fiscal 2020, fiscal 2021, you have this massive deficit. You go out to the taxpayers and you say, look, we need an override of 10, 15%. Or do you go for an earlier one in calendar 2019 and say there's going to be a smaller override of, let's say, 7, 8, 10%. It's not going to be the 15, and it will last us probably just as long. So people will pay, you'll end up paying the same amount of money, but you won't get that sticker shock of 15% that shows up all at once.
So given the fact that, as you said, we are already well beyond what was the projected time frame for the 2011 override, do you think that there's going to be any resistance among taxpayers in Arlington to the earlier the earlier next override, which again is going to be much smaller and nonetheless still have the same effect? In other words, last a similar amount of time to waiting another year or two and then having a much bigger hit.
Yeah,
so
I think there would
would
be.
expect that.
Yeah, there will be a
people are not-
resistance. So there are multiple large factors in play when we move towards the next override scenario. The first one and the big one is that at the same time we'll be looking for an operating override, we will probably go out for a debt exclusion vote on the Arlington High School building project, which is going to be most likely north of $200 million. The state will reimburse us for a large chunk of that. Let's say it's about 40 to 45%, but that will be a significant hit to the average taxpayer. We've talked about that in prior segments where it could be anywhere from, it could be $300, it could be $600 per household. So at the same time you're going out for those together. So there's a risk that there could be sticker shock, and people could say, "Well, I'm not paying for this." If you delay it, you also run into a different scenario, which is you're now going out for multiple tax increases over multiple years. We had the tax increase in 2016 where we were funding or asked the taxpayers to pay for bringing the Gibbs back online in the Thompson School addition. We're going to have the operating override at some point, whether that's 19, 20, or 21, and we have the Arlington High project. So there is always a risk that there could be tax increase fatigue on the part of the voters, which really means that anybody who's a member of the town government, whether you're appointed, elected, whatever your role is, really needs to, A, make sure everything's in order in terms of their fiscal responsibility, which I think it is, and B, also communicate to the residents, the voters, taxpayers, why this is important and why we have spent your money wisely and why we're being fiscally prudent and we're not being, superfluous or just wasteful with your dollars.
Yeah, and I think we hadn't even mentioned the fact that there was also the Minuteman. We signed on to a little increased debt for Minuteman as well. Yep. So you're right, all this has happened in the last few years, and people may very well have. Don't we always experience fatigue whenever we know that our taxes are gonna go up?
Yep.
It never seems like, oh sure, it's been long enough, I'm ready for this. No, that's not really how people react. But I understand what it is that you're saying, that politically it's a tough question, how to figure out how to do this. But it does seem to me that either you are going to combine the two or you're going to separate the two, that being the structural override and the debt exclusion. If you separate the two, you're not separating them by very long, right?
No.
You're separating them by one fiscal year to the next perhaps, or maybe two or something like that.
Yep.
So, I'm editorializing and I apologize to the audience for that, but it's hard for me to understand, and myself as a taxpayer here in Arlington, why it would be any more palatable to anybody to have that separated by a couple of years rather than just suck it up, basically, and deal with it.
Yeah, if I had to guess, based on the meetings we had at long-range planning, at the Budget Revenue Task Force, I think the inertia, and then, ultimately the selectmen are the only people that can put these votes before the voters. My expectation would be that we go earlier versus later. So I could see a combined debt exclusion and operating override vote in the spring, summer, or fall of 2019. That seems to make the most sense for the reasons I laid out. But it also gives you time to react and adjust if the voter feedback, which is their vote, is different than we expected. So, if you push an operating override to the cliff, if you say we're going to push this to 2021, 2022, and it fails, now you have to go with immediate draconian cuts to services, things of that nature. If we put it before the voters in 2019 and it fails, we still have 2 or 3 years to figure out what that means. Maybe they'll be willing to support a smaller override. Maybe they're looking for certain cuts in services. We don't know at this point. And the same thing with the Arlington High project. If it were to fail in 2019, maybe we can then come back and say, okay, let's rework it instead of a tear down rehab conversion, maybe we've got to do something else. But at least it gives you that time versus coming up to the very end where you have no room to do anything.
Yeah, so that's multiple reasons there then for considering really in a serious way, combining these two and presenting them to the voters next year, 2019, at some point. Let's talk a little bit about the school project, actually. And we know that we're in the process of the feasibility study being completed.
Yep.
And we are awaiting word as to what, obviously need to talk to architects, et cetera, but awaiting word on what a viable final figure or estimated figure would be for that rebuild, and then what the MSBA is willing to contribute, right? So the MSBA, the state entity that is going to help fund the rebuild. What do you see as, we've talked to others about the potential scenarios of brand new school in a different location, keeping the school open as renovations are happening, et cetera. Either, your viewpoints yourself or what you see the committee moving, or the various committees moving towards. Give us a little bit of an update on where the thinking is about that.
Yeah, so we have a school building committee that we have formed. It's a requirement under the MSB's rules for them to participate in funding. And so they're working through the process of looking at different sites and alternatives and how that new school will look, things like that. They've done a great job. They've followed along. It's a robust process. It's excellent. The big step coming up, though, and it looks like they're starting to focus in on rebuilding at Arlington High School at the current site. And so the first step will be, how do we build or rehab or do demolition or any type of construction in an active school zone? Because you're going to have children that are being educated there while the construction is going on. That leads, as a finance person, to my big concern, which is how this drives the cost. And so there are two big numbers you have to look at in these projects. The gross number, what the total project will cost, and the net number, which is what it costs after the state reimburses it. And so Arlington's reimbursement on school projects has historically been about 50%. Let's say for the sake of this project, because there'll be some other variables, it's 45%. The state, through the process, will make it very clear what construction activities they will and will not participate in. And so if we reach a point where there's a divergence between what Arlington wants to do and what the state feels is educationally necessary, they will shift 100% of that cost for that element to us. And so the examples I can give you are, first would be a pool. There's a group of residents in town who are pushing to add a pool to the complex as part of the construction project. The state has been somewhat clear on it, or I would say very clear, that they would not participate in that because there isn't an educational need. So if an indoor pool were to cost, let's say $5, $6, $7 million, that would be fully borne by the taxpayers of Arlington with no reimbursement from the state. Same historically has gone for gymnasiums, field houses, auditoriums above, I think, 750 students, and non-government or non-educational services. So we have the town comptroller in the high school, information technologies there, and school administration is there. None of that would be reimbursed by the state. And so that starts to lead to a real thought on what the net number is going to be to the taxpayer, because if it's a $200 million building and we follow everything that the state wants us to do and we can get everything to be educationally checked off, I would say, and they participate at 45%, they would give us $90 million. So the net cost to the taxpayer is, let's say, $110 million divided by the number of parcels. Now, if the cost were to go up because we wanted to put other things onto it, a pool, a field house, things like that, now the cost of the building could be $225 million, but the state's portion is going to stay strong at $90 million. And so now the net to the taxpayer under that scenario could be $135 million. And so there are a lot of decisions that are going to have to be made on, what we want for a new building, what the state's willing to pay for, and what we're willing, if the state doesn't want to pay for their 45%, what are we willing to pay 100% for?
At the point at which we're talking about a potential override and debt exclusion being placed before the populace, say again 2019, using that scenario, will we have a firm and reliable idea of what the MSBA contribution to the school project will be, so that we really know what we're on the hook for as taxpayers? Or can that actually, can that be known as of that time, or is there some kind of fuzziness to that figure?
It has to be known as of that time. So one of the things that's interesting, and I see it as treasurer, is when you go out for a debt exclusion, you list the project. You don't list the amount that the project's going to cost. And I think that gives people some angst of, how can costs spiral out of control. Then what happens is when you go to the state to actually have them approve the project and allow you to put it on the tax rate, things of that nature, they want to see the materials that you put before the voters, before the debt exclusion, on what it was going to cost. And so a good example I can give to you of that is the Thompson School project. So the Thompson School project, when we did it, we had told the voters it was going to be a $25 million project. It was that was the number we had set, and we said there might be some movement from there, but 25 was the number. Subsequent to that, what we realized that there were some things that we really should do in the building. We had thought about it as deferred maintenance that we'd do 5-10 years from now, changing the windows and a couple other things. But that really, it proved not to be intelligent to wait that amount of time, and we should do it now. Cost of the project increased to $27 million. So we started 25, we moved to 27. When we went to the state to ask them for flexibility to increase the debt exclusion, they said we could increase it from 25 to 26 for some of this, but they wouldn't let us go to 27. They said, you told the voters $25 million, we'll let you go to 26, but you're not going to 27, you have to find another source. And so we have found alternative sources within the capital budget to pay for that $1 million. The reason that's important is when we get to Arlington High, we have to put a firm number out there with the debt exclusion, so when we go to then put it on the tax rolls, we can say to the Department of Revenue, yes, we told the voters it was going to be a $200 million project. And at that point, if it were to go above that, so if we were 225, 250, something like that, DOR wouldn't let us go. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't let us keep going.
Literally wouldn't let us keep going.
Not under the debt exclusion. You'd have to find sources of revenue within the operating budget to cover it, which we don't have.
Okay, so that all sounds relatively complicated, but distilling it, what you're saying is we need to have that number from MSBA, and we need to have a good firm number before we present the debt, before the debt exclusion is presented.
Firm and final, yes. And then the state will make us. The way to look at it is we have to have a firm and final number of what we're going to have, and that's great because when we have a firm gross number, we're going to know what the net number is going to be as well, because the state will tell us what their participation is going to be. So we'll have a firm and final number, and then the state will hold us to it.
Okay, and last thing perhaps on this subject for now, you had mentioned that the school building committee has been looking at different scenarios for how to proceed, and that some of them have included looking at other spaces, and others have proceeded along the lines of building onto the school or replacing the school as it stands. Is there any sense of which of those is most likely? It's hard for me to imagine that there's another viable site. So it seems to me like we are going to be looking at a rebuild of the school on the site itself.
That is fair, yes. We're almost certainly looking at a rebuild of the site. They had looked at the building committee at alternative sites over at Poets Corner, maybe acquiring some of the MIRAC property, and none of those really have turned out to be viable or reasonable. And so it looks like the project will take place on the existing site, which is extremely complicated. I think the first complication is that there are students in the building. If you're not building it somewhere else, you're now building in place. Then that leads to, so you start to say, okay, let's get on a decision tree. And the next thing the committee's dealing with is the fact that though you'd like maybe to build some wings on the current open space or green space, sort of do a swap. We'll build a building here and then we'll demo it so you won't have a net change in green space. Multiple areas around that complex are toxic. The largest one that most people remember is the football field. The football field's a capped site. Pierce Field's a capped site. So you're not going to build on Pierce Field. And then I know the softball field next to it, I believe, is also a capped site, even though there's grass on it. So you have limited area in which you can build. And so we'll start as we try to build in place, we're gonna have to go through a series of discussions, or the building committee is going to have to go through a series of discussions and figuring out how to build that school in a cost-effective manner on that site. And one of the things that always comes up is the front of the building in the facade, because if most of the back or a large portion of the back is toxic, the front is not toxic. And so you can build in the front and you can push the school out to the front. And so when you bring this up with the average, resident, voter, taxpayer, they'll say, well, I love the front of the building. I love that there's open space, even though it's not used by anyone. I love that the columns are there on the building. I love the long facade. This is great. And so something I always say to them is I say, okay, well, how great is it for you? If we were to say that, in order to maintain all that, we're going to have to increase the cost of the building project by $20 million, that you are, as a taxpayer, going to have to pay 100% because the state won't go along with it. Is it worth that much for you? And some people say, yeah, it's worth that much. And other people say, no, it's not that pretty. Remember what I'm saying is when I say building out, I'm talking about building, building out front. But you would tear down an equivalent portion of the existing building, so your net impact on open space would be zero. You'd have the same amount of open space. It would just be somewhere else.
Reconfigured, right.
And that's a big decision when it comes to the cost. Because when I talk about that gross cost and that net cost, the building committee is going to have to figure out what they want to do. And are they willing to go to the voters and say, we're going to add a significant amount of unreimbursed cost, or the cost of modulars or anything like that is going to be significantly more, because we want to preserve this one element of the building.
Okay, so final question then about this, and that is, given that you have presented very persuasive arguments about why both politically and perhaps fiscally as well, it makes sense to present this to the voters as soon as possible, which would be a year more or less from now, sometime in 2019. Given the complication of what you've just been describing, of what the building committee is having to consider, is it reasonable to assume that they will be able to make all the decisions that need to be made in order to present a concrete figure and comprehensive plan within a year's time?
Yes. And the good news we have is, though it's Arlington's building committee, though it's compiled or comprised of residents of Arlington in various capacities, whether it's town officials, appointed, professional staff, or residents, we remain under a very structured process that is governed by the Massachusetts School Building Authority. So this isn't our citizens, volunteers, professional staff that are trying to figure it out under their own process. They are told by the Commonwealth what they will be doing along each step, how long each step will take, and when it has to be concluded by. And so while a lot of work like that over the course of a year seems like overwhelming, or at least to get to a conceptual, final idea of what we're going to do, the state does this all the time. While this might be our one building project for the next 50 to 100 years, they do 10 to 15 high schools a year. And so,
So we can kind of lean on their expertise as well.
But we have to stay within their expertise. Mm-hmm. Leaning's a nice way of saying if we run afoul of them, we'll have a very expensive school that they won't pay for.
Right.
Yes.
So a politically phrased
kind way to
perhaps
feel like we have more authority than we do.
All right, so I think we have established pretty clearly then that what the parameters are for both the school rebuild and what the reasons are for the override that is also going to be presented. What we are going to want to do next, and we're going to take a short break and then come back and do that, is really look concretely at the scenarios that were presented to the Budget Revenue Task Force that go out from 3 to 5 years, I believe, or go between 3 and 5 years for the override, and also different onsets for that happening, I should say override and debt exclusion. And we'll just kind of dig into the weeds on those when we come back.
Awesome.
After this short break, we will be back with those delights in front of us. Don't forget to join us.
The IRS is calling me? Can this be for real?
Fraud is real. Hang up on fraud. Americans have lost more than $23 million by giving out information and money to criminals impersonating the Internal Revenue Service. Scammers are aggressive when they contact a potential victim and claim to be from the IRS. They often use a fake telephone number with a U.S. area code. They demand immediate payment. They may even threaten police arrest or deportation. Don't believe them. Instead, just hang up. Don't provide any information to these crooks. The real IRS will generally first make contact by letter and will never demand immediate payment or threaten force. If you suspect you've been contacted by an IRS scammer, submit an incident report with the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration at www.tigta.gov. Call the TIGTA hotline at 1-800-366-4484. Please share this message.
So we want to, first of all, apologize to the viewers because we're going with a lower tech version of this than we were hoping for, but we were unsuccessful in trying to get an electronic version. So here we are, nonetheless, looking at the numbers and the scenarios that we were talking about before. Here we begin on the left side with the baseline. And if you could just describe what it is that people are looking at in looking at that.
So the baseline scenario as put together by the town manager's office is how our budget structure is looking currently based on our current revenue and expenditure projections through fiscal year 2025. And so what it shows is in fiscal 18, we had a budget surplus. In fiscal 19, in fiscal 20, we're starting to pull money out of our override stabilization fund.
Which you can see here.
Which we had talked about in the last segment, which is, that's money we had banked in earlier years. And then beginning in fiscal year 2021, we are going to not have any more money to take out of the override stabilization fund. And so we are going to have deficits.
And that's what you had mentioned earlier in our earlier conversation. And here we've got a relatively palatable deficit of $683,000 or something like that. But then I believe this is what you were referring to as the cliff.
That's the cliff.
And obviously that is a very unignorable figure right there, currently set for fiscal 2022.
Correct. And what makes the cliff even more concerning is, you take a cursory look at it and you say, okay, well, it's a $16 million deficit on $164 million revenue. So you do back of the envelope and you say 10%. It's not 10% because embedded in that 164 million is the property tax number, is state chapter 70, excise tax, and all sorts of other.
So it includes things beyond the property tax.
Correct. So if I remember correctly, the property tax number for that year is about $130 million. So we would have to increase the $130 million number by $16 million. So it would come out to be about a 12.2% property tax increase above the ordinary 2.5% increase.
And let's be clear that if we were to do that, to resolve that $16+ million deficit, that would only get us 1 year to fiscal year 2023, correct, where we would still have what remains here as the difference between those two, another $3 million deficit and compounding from there.
Yes, agreed.
Okay, so all of that is what we want to avoid, obviously, yes. And that is why we are talking about here 3 different scenarios for a fiscal 2020. In other words, in the calendar year 2019, as we discussed before, an onset there of an override, either going 3 years, 4 years, or 5 years, yep, versus waiting another year to fiscal year 2021 or calendar year 2020, and the same thing, a 3-year, a 4-year, or a 5-year override. Immediately, I am struck by a couple of things. Yeah. One is the fact that you have 3, 4, and 5-year override durations of that override. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about, is that just kind of standard fiscal practice to look at 3, 4, and 5-year terms? Mm-hmm. How is it that you arrive at that?
So historically, under the town's budgeting process, when the stakeholders meet, we've generally stayed away from any 1-year override scenario because it would feel pretty negligent. I mean, you go out to the voters and you say, hey, we need to bridge this gap. We need 5, 6, 7% increase, and we'll be back for another one next year. To us, it shows a lack of planning, a lack of leadership, or any type of conscious thought on where we're going. And so from there you start saying, okay, well, we're gonna have a multi-year override scenario. And as a starting point, what we've tried to do is have more than one scenario. So this is what 3 years will look like, this is what 4 years will look like, and this is what 5 years will look like. We've always tried to stay away from anything more than 5 years, just because the dollar numbers get so big at that point that it doesn't feel like it's responsible or anything anyone wants to look at. So we start here, we have a 3, a 4, and a 5. From here, the town's professional staff, elected officials will start to talk, discuss, and figure out which scenarios are the best. Should we do 3, 4, which one, 3, 4, or 5? And then from there, the next step, as we talked about earlier, is what year we're gonna go for. Are we gonna do it in 2020 or are we gonna do it in 2021? So it's just sort of a large deliberative process to make sure we explore all options, we know what they are, and we try to arrive at the right answer.
Okay, and so I can see, and we'll just make it clear to people, that this is a 3-year override, which means that this figure is going to be lower than this figure, well, than either of the other two, because the override's only going to last 3 years out before we are again in deficit and needing another override.
Yep.
This one projects out 4 years, so therefore it's going to be a little bit more expensive to go out 4 years, and then more expensive again to go out 5.
Yep.
So I wanted to draw people's attention. We were discussing earlier in the conversation the wisdom of, well, we'll defer the idea about combining the two projects into one ask, but the wisdom of an earlier onset in 2019 versus 2020. And I was saying, it seemed to me that there's not a compelling reason to wait necessarily. I find that there's a very compelling reason not to wait, and I'm just going to pick one example. That is looking at a 5-year override so that we don't have to deal with it, at least theoretically, for at least 5 years. And the figure here is $767 per household with a 5-year override that would be voted in next year.
Yep.
If we waited another year and did the same thing, a 5-year override, but instead starting in fiscal year 2021 instead of 2020, look at that figure, folks. That says $1,133 per household. So roughly speaking, math is not my forte, but that looks to me like about a 50% difference between the ask here and waiting just one more year. To me, that ends the argument right there, but maybe you want to provide more context to those numbers than I can, than I can discern myself.
No, I think you hit the nail right on the head, which is, the average tax bill in town right now is somewhere between $7,400 and $7,500. So if you just take the difference of $767 and $1,100 and overlay that against $7,500, I mean, it's a significant increase by waiting a year. The other thing it also does by waiting is not only do you have a larger dollar that year, you have fewer options if your override fails. So if we go out for an override in fiscal 19, we ask for a 10% override on top of the normal 2.5%. It is a successful override. We will likely have budget stability for 5 years. If it were to fail in 2019 or spring, fall 2019, we now still have time to go back, sharpen our pencils, figure out what the voters didn't like about that request, and get a different request in front of them in the spring of 2020 to maintain the budget through 2021. Maybe they come back and they say, look, we don't want a 5-year scenario, we want 3 or 4 years. Through whatever community outreach you did, you read the tea leaves wrong, and that's not what we want. Or maybe they want scaled back services or whatever. But waiting doesn't give you that. You go to 2020 and you go out to the voters and they rebuff you. We're in a world of trouble because we have a $16 million operating deficit and probably no comprehensive plan to fix it, or how we would go forward with it. So you're talking about quick draconian cuts, which wouldn't be good for anyone. And that's why, in a lot of ways, that first scenario, which is not just only lower in terms of dollars, but gives you that back end to think about it. If it doesn't pass. Another
good argument there. Will the voters, let us assume that, we know that either in 2019, calendar year 2019 or calendar year 2020, we are going to be presented with one of these scenarios. Do voters at this point, do Arlington residents at this point have a chance to weigh in on whether they would prefer a 3, 4, or 5-year timeline? Or is that a decision that is going to be made by the deliberative bodies that are kind of charged with such things, and then presented to town meeting, at which point the voters can, weigh in?
Yes, so ultimately the decision on the size and scope of any override is the sole prerogative of the Board of Selectmen.
Okay.
So they get a lot of feedback from various stakeholders within the town government, whether it's myself, the school committee, the town's professional staff, finance committee members, capital planning committee members, town meeting members. They try to get as much discussion that they have. They also talk to community members, get people's sense of what they like and don't like, if they're happy with the level of services they have, if they're not happy with them. And so, ultimately it's up to them to sort of reach out to people, understand what they think the direction is, and make an informed decision.
Okay, so what we are looking at is the scenarios that were presented at the Budget and Revenue Task Force. Voters and our audience can now see this on their screens. They may do you know whether Arlingtonians have an option of accessing these scenarios themselves to be able to peruse them at their leisure, electronically or in hard copy or anything like that?
Yeah, so it's something we've been actually talking about internally, where I don't think this document right now is readily available or as readily available as it should be, but we have been talking about we call it resident engagement processes, sort of marketing the plan, getting feedback, and talking to different constituent groups and different residents on what they want. And so while a lot of these documents right now continue to be internal documents that show up at public meetings, and if you're at a public meeting, you can get a copy of it, it isn't yet readily available. But the plan is, as we try to go out and solicit feedback, and then subsequent to that, try to market the plan, a lot of these documents will be out there for people to see.
Okay, so if we can assume that, audience members for this show at least are getting a chance to look at this now, if somebody's got a strong opinion about either the duration or the onset of the override and debt exclusion, it is to the Board of Selectmen that they would want to make their opinions heard?
Yeah, I mean, they're the ultimate recommending body. So, but now some people have a bit of an edge. So if you're a town meeting member, town meeting reviews and approves the budget each year. So if you have deep concerns with the amount of spending that's going on in town, the budget's usually the time as a town meeting member to point that out. And I would say, frankly, if you've been opposed to the level of spending in this town and you're a town meeting member, you probably should have proposed something by now. I mean, we've been doing this for 7 or 8 years, so to say nothing is strange. Mm-hmm. But likewise, if you're a citizen, there, besides the selectmen, there's, like I said, the channel of the finance committee, town meeting, the various elected officials. You can always talk to me. I mean, they're avenues you can go to.
Right, and certainly it has been our experience on your Arlington Dollar and any number of other ACMi programs that Arlington officials do make themselves readily available and are generally interested in feedback from the citizenry. So I have no doubt that will continue to be the case as we move forward towards one of these scenarios. As if these numbers are not
Scary
sobering enough,
Yeah,
they're not the whole story.
they're not.
As it turns out. These are just to deal with the structural override that, again, is going to be setting in fiscal year 21 in a minor way and then in a big way the following year.
Yep.
But as we talked about in our conversation, as everybody is aware of, we've got the high school rebuild looming right here, the estimated high school debt impacts.
Yep.
So talk us through this final chart here.
Yep, so this chart is part of the information provided by the town manager's office, and it lists 3 different scenarios of cost for the high school. And these are dealing with the net cost of the project. So in the last segment, we had said that there's a gross cost, less what the state is willing to refund or reimburse to us, equals the net cost to the town of Arlington. So the first number is $100 million. That would be assuming, I would say that is like the dream, ultimate perfect scenario, probably highly unlikely. But that's the low end case of what it would cost the town. And under $100 million cost to the town of Arlington, it would be $392 impact on the tax bill for the average taxpayer. Moving along one step to the right, you have $125 million cost. That is probably the middle case or more likely scenario after we're done with the reimbursement process, and that's $490 to the average taxpayer. And now we get into that discussion that we had earlier, which is if we start to do things in the project that MSBA doesn't want to pay for, if we want to have a pool, a track, an indoor track, a field house, we want to keep all of the school administration and the comptroller and IT in the high school. Now we're looking at a scenario where maybe the gross cost didn't go up that much, but because all of it flowed through to us, we're now paying $150 million. And under that scenario, it's about $589 to the average taxpayer.
So we're talking about differences of hundreds, $800, roughly speaking, for each $25,000 that goes up. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, $25 million that goes up. So real money here, but also let's just be crystal clear that if we assume that, as we were discussing earlier, this is presented to the voters sometime in calendar year 2019 mm-hmm. and is approved. Mm-hmm. Most likely, knowing the way that this town approaches its fiscal responsibilities, I would imagine we're going to be looking at 5-year overrides because, in general, I think that that's more palatable to everybody. So just to quickly thumbnail calculate, we're talking about 767 plus more or less 400. So let's say $1,150 is what people are going to be looking at as a hit on their property taxes. That's again the average property tax, which you had said was around $7,500. Yeah. So we are looking at something like a 15%.
On top of the 2.5%.
On top
so
of the
we're really all in on that 1 year to be 17.5%.
All right, yeah. That's the kind of hit that we're talking about here. So that certainly buttresses what you were saying earlier about, people could turn this down.
Absolutely they could. One of the interesting, I had a resident, I was talking to a resident, and she was a long-term resident of the town. I think she told me she lived here for 50 years. I sort of estimated she was in her mid-70s. And she kind of jokingly said to me, she said, one thing would be helpful, could you please stop referring to a 20-year debt exclusion as temporary to people that are 75 years old? And I was like, oh yeah, that's a very valid point you're making there. Because depending on your economic situation, these numbers are gonna mean something different to you. If you're a young family, you're in your mid-30s, you're about to send kids to school, you've just sent your kids to school, and you look at a 20-year bill for a high school rebuild, you think, okay, that'll be great because my children are gonna be in school for the next 13 years. If I have younger children, they're gonna be 15, 16 years. This is a great investment for me. If you're on the other end of the spectrum of residents and you've lived in this town for 20, 30, 40 years, your children are gone from the school, you are not personally consuming the same level of services that you were 20, 30, 40 years ago, these numbers are a lot more daunting.
Yes, and then let us throw in one other X factor, which we are quite concerned about in your Arlington dollar and in general, and that is that latter scenario you were just describing. Let's add in if you're on a fixed income. Right. Because of course, the older you get, the more likely that is in some ways. Mm-hmm. And so adding, again, 15% to what is already, or 17.5 as you said, to what is already a steep property tax bill for a lot of folks who've lived here a long time, you can see why, however much fiscal sense it might make, this is going to again be a tough row to hoe politically with certain number of Arlingtonians.
Well, exactly, and that's why when in the earlier segment and then briefly a moment ago when I start talking about on the high school rebuild, the degree to which we stay within the MSBA confines versus go outside the MSBA confines. That's why I keep highlighting that because you're adding cost to long-term residents who aren't going to consume the services. And so you got to ask, it's a political calculation of saying, you have all these groups and all these different people that want to add things into the building project that might not be or won't be reimbursable. If that leads to a, let's say, $200 a year increase to the average tax bill, are you now risking angering somebody who normally would have supported it into voting against you? And the town's history of overrides and debt exclusions is quite interesting, because people will look at the June 2016 debt exclusion, which passed, I think, 70-30. It was by wide margins, and say, well, that's going to be the new normal in Arlington, because the 2011 and the 2006 overrides were very close, 51-49. One thing I like to point people to is when you go back to the elementary school debt exclusions, which happened before that, those passed by wide margins. Those were like 60-40 or something like that. And so the town, when we have an identified project with a fixed cost and in a fixed timetable, the town has really consistently passed those types of projects over the last 20 years.
By comfortable margins.
By comfortable margins. Overrides have not been comfortable. And so the scenario that we're going to really have to think about when we look at the overarching thought is, do we have the ability to pass these? Do we have the ability to pass a 5-year if we wait until 2021? Or should we go earlier? Should we do a 3-year? And then one thing that I think is sort of in the backdrop to a lot of this is a lot of the drivers, the big driver of cost right now are increases in school enrollment that are requiring additional funding for the school department. All of the school department's projections are showing their enrollment leveling off or being fully absorbed by about fiscal 2024, fiscal 2025. So if we can, I don't want to say hold on, but in some ways hold on and get there to 2024, 25 in a fiscally responsible manner, will the road ahead be easier after that? And so that's a big thing to contemplate. One other thing that I'll point out, because I think people they tend to think of these things in silos, is it's very revenue growth. And one of the things that we've been fortunate to have in town is our property tax revenue growth, our new growth, has exceeded our projections for several years. So what I'd tell anybody to do, and I tell people to do, is go look at the 5-year plan starting in 2011, fiscal 2012, and where we said property tax revenue would be 5 years from now. And then go look where it actually was, and you'll see it grew considerably. And one of the main driver of that new growth have been people improving their homes, whether it's kitchen renovations or tear downs. And so what's also interesting that's going on in town right now is there have been a lot of people who are pushing to stop these tear downs in town because they don't like them, they don't think they fit the character of the community. But if you were to stop those tear downs, you would stop new growth. And so now we have an interesting scenario where, and we do have some people in town that are doing this very step, which is on one hand, they're advocating for more spending. And then in the next sentence, they advocate to cut off part of the revenue that would fuel this. And so these are very difficult decisions that we're going to make. And so one thing the Board of Selectmen has actively talked about is putting a moratorium on tear downs. Well, if they do that, they would almost certainly increase the structural deficit to a bigger number. So now we're not talking about a 12% property tax increase. We could be talking about 14%. We could be talking about 13%. And it's something that I think the average resident doesn't think about because they tend to think about each issue in a silo, but they all pull together. And so there's a lot of decision making that has to be done, a lot of policy making that has to be done that will have significant impacts on the town's finances for years to come.
Well, I have to say, for our viewers, we certainly wish we were presenting a rosier scenario, but very important, I think, for this series, Your Arlington Dollar, and for what ACMi and I know our local officials are also trying to do all the time. And that is this. Everybody's coming at things from their own perspective, as you said. Those perspectives can be in conflict. The noise can be considerable around those, the noise that people make, et cetera. What we want to do in this series, what you have helped us do today, is show you what the numbers are.
Yep.
And make sure that all of the arguments and conversations and discussions and deliberations that go on over the next year or two, which are going to be so necessary here in town, at least can be based on the numbers themselves and not simply on people's as you said, siloed expectations.
Yeah, and one thing I would say that's I think residents should be very proud of in Arlington, because I don't think it's always been this way here, and it certainly isn't this way in a lot of other levels of government, whether it's, local, county, state, and federal, is, there's that old saying, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts or your own set of facts. And one thing that's been great in Arlington is even if people have differences, we have a common set of facts. We have a common set of numbers. Now, you could feel like we don't spend enough in town. You could feel like we spend too much in town. You could feel like our new growth is too slow. You could think our new growth is too much. But nobody argues the numbers, the core information. And I think that's a huge thing that everybody in Arlington should be proud of, is that their government, their appointed officials, their professional staff, their elected officials, that we're not running around with three different sets of the quote unquote truth. There are facts, there are no alternative facts, and we make decisions and have discussions based on that. So that's really something to be excited about.
Yeah, and I think we can, as you said, be happy that we live in this town.
Yeah.
And that operates on those principles. So some tough decisions to come. I really appreciate our town treasurer, Dean Carman, taking time to take us through the numbers and do so exhaustively. Hope that you will have gotten something from this analysis with Dean Carman, and we invite you to attend our future programs, both with Dean and in general, as we try and make sure we keep our focus on the facts and allow you to make decisions in the most informed way possible. For your Arlington Dollar, for Town Treasurer Dean Carman, I'm James MILAN. Appreciate you joining us.